My name's Rebecca Martin, and I'm one of the business development managers here at Real Story Group. And I wanted to start by thanking you for taking the time to join Real Story Group in a conversation around benchmarking your effectiveness with both SharePoint and Office 365 environments. So both SharePoint on-premise and Office 365 are diverging in important ways, but many organizations are licensing both environments in order to support a variety of different collaboration use cases. So the question then becomes, how successful are you at exploiting these environments? And as they are delivering business value for it, how are you measuring it? And so today we want to talk about that. We're going to walk you through our tool that can benchmark your effectiveness in regards to SharePoint and Office 365 as social collaboration platforms. The tool we're going to talk about today is called Real Score, and it's different from the way we've typically engaged with organizations via our research subscriptions. Real Score is all about helping organizations optimize the effectiveness of the technology that you already have. This tool is going to provide you with a numerical grade that you can use to benchmark your enterprise's capabilities in the context of a progressive roadmap, your progress over time, and in relation to your peers. We've provided this type of assessment in our consulting engagements for over 15 years now, but it can be a pricey thing for our clients to undertake. So we built this tool as a way to provide organizations now to do it on a self-assessment type basis, and we're really excited to walk you through it and to show you the tool. So just a quick introduction for those of you joining us that aren't familiar with Real Story Group. The core of everything we do is based in our research. And there's a few different ways that we help organizations from a research and advisory perspective. The first way is Real Quadrant. It's our shortlist builder tool. It's unique to the analyst industry, and it's really designed to get you to the right shortlist based on your specific use cases and strategic considerations. The second way that we work with organizations is what we're talking about today, which is Real Score. So more on that. And then finally, the way a good portion of our subscribers leverage our expertise is through what we call our Plus subscription. It's a great way to kind of combine the research that we offer as well as the advisory time from our analysts. So it's kind of a win-win for many of our subscribers. Moving on to the next slide, it really highlights something that's unique in the analyst world, and we have yet to find another analyst firm that adheres to the strict independence that we have here at Real Story Group. But we do not work for vendors in any capacity. It's important to highlight this. This allows us to be the toughest critics out there. We're absolutely unbiased when evaluating where these products are potentially a good fit, and then maybe more importantly for you, the technology buyer, where they're not such a good fit. Just before I turn it over to Tony, a few quick mentions. For those of you on the call, as a follow-up, we're going to be passing along the slides so that you can have those as a quick reference. For the subscribers on the line, we're going to have an archived version of today's webinar made available to you behind the wall on your subscriber dashboard. And then finally, if you have any questions as we move through the presentation, feel free to type your question up in the chat window, and we'll be sure to address it. So with that, Tony, I will go ahead and turn it over to you to get started.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. This is a topic that's really near and dear to our hearts, which is, historically, Real Story Group has helped people and still helps people identify what's the best fitting technology based on research. But then there's the issue of, well, what about the tools, that we already have? And I think that, our customers have been looking for some structured ways of kind of evaluating, and particularly, I think this is particularly germane when it comes to SharePoint, because there's this old expression, SharePoint happens. Like a lot of you, just have it in your environment, and so if it's a given, if it's a 6-star in your constellation, okay, that's all well and good, but you still have to ask yourself just how effective are we? What value are we getting out of this? So this is going to be a fairly rapid-fire analysis of this. First, we're going to do a little context setting with respect to your SharePoint estate, and then we'll sort of describe why you should be benchmarking your effectiveness, and then I'll show you a couple of different approaches, one looking at SharePoint qua SharePoint, and then the other looking at kind of the broader social collaboration perspective, and then we'll wrap up with next steps. As Rebecca mentioned, if you have any questions or comments or anything you disagree with, please use the Questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. That's the Questions tab and you can ask anything or express any of your own opinions about what you see, and we'll definitely have time to get to that. Okay, so it's very interesting, you know, when we listen to enterprises, they talk about this notion of the SharePoint estate. I'm not sure where that metaphor, that term came up, but I think it's very apt. I think in many organizations, particularly large organizations, you've built these huge chateau-like structures around SharePoint with many different rooms, a lot of customization, in many cases very, very beautiful, at least from the outside. But the question then becomes, as the world changes, you have this big kind of immovable platform, and you have to ask yourself, is this estate really still working for us for all the sorts of things that we want to be doing in our digital workplace? And so it really begs a couple of themes. One is, okay, in this estate, you need to first look outward and say, you know, what are alternatives to SharePoint, and what other systems do we need to know for a more employee-centric digital workplace? And you know, and so these are interesting and increasingly urgent questions. But you also need to look in and say, okay, well, we've made these investments, either substantial investments in SharePoint on-premise, or we're making certain commitments, potentially long-term commitments to Office 365. Really looking inward and saying to yourself, you know, how effective are we? Are we getting the value? And in particular, you know, how are we doing relative to our peers? So that's really what this half hour is all about, kind of looking a little bit inward on the estate. So Office 365 is, of course, the sort of next generation of this. Microsoft has been aggressively driving their customers through financial incentives and otherwise. And of course, there's this general theme of moving to the cloud, which is pervasive throughout not just external digital engagement, but of course digital workplace environments. What was interesting about this in Office 365 initially earlier this year, the word SharePoint wasn't even there. It was almost like debranded from the whole equation, which we found, you know, really interesting. What then happened, I think, was that there was a little bit of a backlash that many of you led, which was A, SharePoint on-prem is still important, and B, I still want SharePoint in Office 365. And so now, of course, sites, as you know, been rebranded SharePoint. In the meantime, a number of other things have come online, including groups out of the Exchange team, and now Office 365 Teams, which actually came out of Skype for Business. So what's happening with Office 365, of course, is that a number of different social collaboration services are being disseminated across a variety of these different touch points, of course, Yammer being the fourth one worth mentioning. And so increasingly in our research, we're treating Office 365 a little bit differently. But for today, we're going to show a couple different ways of benchmarking, and they both sort of assume that you have you know, both on-prem and Office 365, but they both work if you're solely committed to one environment or another. So this isn't surprising to you that many of you are experiencing SharePoint challenges. We've done some research here. Other firms have done research. A lot of issues that we're facing around staffing, executive buy-in, governance. Interesting, increasingly getting better and better with each year, but still user adoption a problem. And for many of you, a prohibitive or difficult problem. And user adoption is really critical because that's where you get a lot of value, but it also kind of calls the question around, are you actually delivering effective services? And so if you have a user adoption problem, that's usually a symptom rather than a cause. It's a symptom of something more deeper in terms of integrating effectively into people's flow of work and the things that they need to do to get done. So how does benchmarking fit in? Well, there's what we describe as a technology capability spectrum, which is a little bit like an effectiveness spectrum from low to high. And so on the high end, you know, you have, of course, what Redmond and the legions of SharePoint fanboys say that SharePoint can accomplish. And then there's what these platforms actually really do, and that's obviously they're not as great as advertised. No big surprise there. And that's kind of a hyperbole gap, and we cover that in our traditional research where we evaluate these tools, as Rebecca said, more critically than really anyone else in the marketplace. But there's another gap here we're going to talk about today, which is really a capacity gap. And so it's what the enterprise has the capacity to do relative to the tool set at their disposal. And SharePoint and Office 365 are potentially very powerful, very sophisticated platforms. And it's really important for you to understand, where are you in terms of your capacity to actually execute on them, and really work, where do you have those gaps, and what can you do to close them? So that's really where benchmarking comes into play here. And as Rebecca mentioned, we put together an online tool to help you do this. You can go to realstorygroup.com/realscore. There's a freemium model for this, so much of what you can actually do, you can just do for free to get your initial score. There's some value-added services for subscribers. And so what this does is ask you a series of critical questions that we put together with our team over the years and in consultation with SharePoint and other experts, and then it outputs capabilities by different metrics. And I'll show you some examples of this in a minute, but the basic concept here is that there's a total possible score, and then in the second column you get a score, and then we benchmark you according to your industry vertical. In this case it's technology companies, but it could be higher ed or government or other, and then there's the full cross-industry, how are people rating themselves, and then sort of where do you stand in that picture. So what I'm going to do here is just switch over to my browser, and I'm logged in here on our site, but you don't need to be logged in, and I've basically gone through the real score here for SharePoint and Office 365, and I'm going to go ahead and open I've already saved one of these, and we'll go to start with things like organizational capacity. So it's asked you a series of questions with some fairly detailed options, and then you go and you can check off. So in terms of business resources, really important. We know that IT resources are critical, but if you don't have the business resources, managing SharePoint and getting operational budgets and training and support, obviously you're kind of up a creek. So we gave ourselves a 2 there, governance and program management, and some detailed potential options there and levels, technical resources and processes, and then of course analytics and optimization. This was one of the areas where when we did this we gave ourselves somewhat higher score. 3, this is typically an area where we find people tend to score relatively low in terms of actual analyzing the metrics and tweaking, optimizing the systems accordingly. That goes across the board in the digital workplace. We tend to see relatively low analytics and optimization scores. This one we're giving ourselves a somewhat higher score. Then we get into actual business capabilities with respect to SharePoint. So there's a key set of considerations here, whether it's SharePoint or Office 365, in terms of social collaboration, document and records management. Of course, everyone needs at some level, and so we gave ourselves a decent score there. Portals and dashboards, again, a key capability from day one. A little bit less evident in Office 365, but certainly a key part of what keeps many of us bound to SharePoint. And then, of course, process management, a key consideration alongside information management. And there's systems maturity and effectiveness, so infrastructure and security, obviously critical in any employee setting, particularly at large-scale enterprises. Search and findability, obviously critically important. We know that many employees evaluate the effectiveness of the digital experience in a workplace setting based on the quality of the search subsystem. So if search isn't working, then in their minds the application sucks. If search is working really well, people will forgive many other sins. And then the scope and the breadth. Are you really dealing with this at a departmental level or at an enterprise level? Have you localized across geographies and language? Have you been able to embed SharePoint or Office 365 into a broader SOA architecture? A lot to talk about there. But we scored ourselves relatively high. Then you get to the results. And so this is the interesting and kind of fun part, which was we got a score of 51 out of 100, which is 51%, which seems kind of low. But what's interesting about it is that if we start comparing ourselves, we actually, it gives us a raw score of 28 against an industry average, technology industry average of about 26, and a cross-industry average of 21.5. So we can look at this and say, hey, you know, from a SharePoint perspective, we're actually not doing too badly here. And then I can toggle this and kind of compare by dimension and look a little bit differently. But then the interesting thing is then sort of breaking down into some of the more details here. So organizational capacity, again, slightly ahead of average, compared by metric, shows that in particular, I think it's our analytics and optimization where we're really kind of tasting the field. So that's good to know. Business capabilities is interesting because here we're actually benchmarking comparatively poorly against not the cross-industry average where our 8 kind of matches up with an 8, but in terms of technology industry participants, and in particular, we have lagged in terms of developing portal and dashboard services. Now, the caveat here, of course, is that maybe portals and dashboards aren't important to us. Maybe they shouldn't be important to us, and that's a judgment call that we can make, but clearly it is to many of our peers in the technology industry if we're a technology company, so maybe this is something that we should start investigating. Then likewise, in terms of systems maturity, we're doing relatively well against our peers. So this was kind of a good news story today as far as this SharePoint goes, but you know, I may want to share this with my colleagues, so I can email these results, or most commonly we find that people will export the results to PowerPoint, and then I won't open it right here, but you know, you can then, it then puts all these charts and everything right into a ready-to-go PowerPoint that you can share with your peers, or more commonly really talk to stakeholders and funders and others to really describe where you're doing well, and ideally to give yourselves a roadmap for, hey, here are the areas we need to improve, here are the areas we're doing relatively well, here's where we're lagging, and need to place some new investments in, say, 2017, 2018. So that's really benchmarking SharePoint and or Office 365 from the perspective of the application. I think what's interesting here about you know, SharePoint is that people can use it for a lot of different things. So what if we look at SharePoint maybe in the context of a different benchmarking model, which would be around social collaboration. So we're not looking at SharePoint per se, we're looking at the domain of enterprise collaboration and social software, you know, social technology. How well are we doing at that? How good are we at leveraging collaboration and social technology, whether it's SharePoint or SharePoint plus Yammer and any number of things. So now we go through this exercise, and again, it gets into different areas around organizational development here, and I won't go through all the details, you can do this for yourself. But then business capabilities around, so this is going to be a little bit similar to SharePoint, but also a little bit more focused on social and collaboration, social networking, information sharing, employee engagement, obviously really critical. And then once again, looking at our systems effectiveness, both from infrastructure and security, depth and breadth, so on and so forth. And then we get our results. And this is the same enterprise again, remember, somewhat lower score, 42. And what's interesting about this is that we're kind of underperforming our peers here in the technology industry. We've got a score of 25, our technology industry average is 34, cross-industry average is 32. So here then we may want to look into some of the dimensions of where are we kind of behind a little bit, and it looks like we've got some real deficits under culture and alignment and community management. So once again, doing well in terms of analytics and optimization, but when we look at this from the standpoint of not just how well are we executing on SharePoint, but how well are we executing on social collaboration, a number of other things come into play here. And you can see that in particular this all-important dimension of community management and culture and alignment, we have some significant gaps there, and so we need to think about what are the different ways that we can close those gaps. And of course, if you're an RSG subscriber, you can arrange for a briefing and a phone call where we can walk you through some techniques for doing that. Similar thing around business capabilities. that from a collaboration standpoint, we're doing okay, but in terms of employee engagement and information sharing, we're lagging not just the technology industry peers, but the whole cross-industry average. And from a systems perspective, again, much the same way we saw in SharePoint, we're doing reasonably well. Maybe we have some infrastructure things we need to take a look at. So this is just a kind of an interesting situation where, you know, by the standards of SharePoint and Office 365, we're actually doing relatively well. But if we took, you know, one of these other areas, then some of the more functional areas here, and we look at it from a broader technology perspective, maybe we're lagging on some of the softer issues. So, you know, I did enterprise collaboration and social software. We could have also looked at ECM, certainly web content and experience management, and obviously enterprise portals, because SharePoint at its heart is still very much of a portal platform. So I encourage you to just try this out yourself, see what lessons you learn, certainly get in touch with us about how we can help you take it, you know, to the next level. A few other comments to make here and things to show you, but I just wanted to reiterate that if you have any questions or comments, anything you agree with or disagree with, feel free to use the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. So if we go back here, you know, we've seen obviously, you know, what are the different ways to do this? And one of the things that I think we've really found this to be most useful is when you do this as a team. So in this case, it's a team that happens to disagree, and that's not unusual, and it's not always unhealthy either. But you know, some people may think, hey, we're doing great with SharePoint. Some other people might say, actually, no, it's not working for us. And so there's different ways to do this. One is to get the whole team together, and we facilitated some of these meetings where we try to get a consensus and everyone does it together. In other cases, we may have people do it separately, and then as part of your subscription, we organize all the different results and show you where there's some non-alignment around team members. Even if you're a happy team, like in the lower right, you don't really, you know, you don't necessarily have any overt disagreements, it can be a good way for you to all get aligned around a roadmap going forward. So definitely encourage you to try this as a team. Here's some examples of what some people have done, some organizations where there's a large hotel chain, and there were sort of differences of perception between marketing and IT about the effectiveness of some of their tool set, and so they were able to get on the same page. Another situation where it was a KM and IT departments who did this assessment jointly, which was really interesting, and they were able to then gain alignment on what their SharePoint strategy was going to be going forward, and they were able to use it then to justify to their peers and their management what were going to be their short-term, medium-term, and long-term effectiveness patterns. So again, you can go and try this as an individual yourself. The key thing is to really think about the questions, which are necessarily, you know, very, very detailed, and be very honest and candid with yourself about where your organization resides, and then see where the results point you. So here's just some short links to some of those things. First, RealScore, you saw. Real Quadrant is our vendor evaluation tool that you can look at. You can always get free excerpts of our research, and you see this vendor map in the background that we've been updating for the last 12 years. So those are just some quick links. And what I'm going to do now is just turn it over to Rebecca while I review some of the questions that are coming in. And once again, if you have any more questions, feel free to just use the Go to Webinar Questions tab in the control.